talk will be some of this talk will be taken from that new research. So I'm delighted to share it with you. Hopefully this will give you some new information. It might be familiar to you, but this is quite an overview of the long development of the relationship between the law, legislation, policing and protest in Britain. As Gwen's introduced, it's really important for us to understand that long history. We can't understand where we are today without understanding where we've come from and so forth. So I've got some slides. Please do interject if you've got any questions in between. I'm not going to talk for too long. Also, I apologise, I'm slightly nasal because I've got this bad cold that everyone seems to have at the moment. So apologies in advance if I'm a bit sniffly. But I'll just share my screen. So hopefully you'll be able to see that. So as I said, this is an overview. It's not going to be completely in depth or cover everything, but hopefully I'll be able to pull through some themes that will be resonating with you in terms of some of the continuities as well as the changes in how the law has developed in relation to protest and policing. And it's obviously incredibly relevant in terms of contemporary debates around what is protest, how it should be policed, what exactly people can do and not do in public space, in particular, excuse me, in relation to their actions and their relationship with other people. Excuse me. So the structure of today's talk is as follows. We're looking at the origins of public order legislation from 1714, how that maps onto the history of working class democratic movements, the history of the development of the legislation in response to those new working class movements, some precedent-making legal cases, and the development of 20th century public order legislation. So there's a lot to get through. As I said, it'll be quite an overview. But what do we want to learn? We want to learn how public order legislation has developed and how much of it is a short-term response to immediate movements that the government or the propertied elites seem to see as a problem, and longer-term developments. So we start actually in the 17th century. They wouldn't call it public order at the time, but more generally riots or tumultuous behaviour is the language. The first piece of legislation I'd like to start off with is the 1662 Tumultuous Petitioning Act, which is passed during the Restoration of the Stuarts. And one of the rights that we've had in England and Wales throughout history is the right to petition the king or his representatives, the Parliament. And in this period, post-Civil War, politicians are very concerned about public order with the presentation of petitions. So they pass legislation which restricts the number of people who can present a petition either to the king or to Parliament to 20 people. And only 10 people can go to the door of Parliament with a petition. So even though excuse me, even though there are restrictions on petitioning, it's never banned, and it's one of the forms of protest that is never made illegal. Excuse me. I'm gonna have to periodically stop and cough. Apologies. But the government is still concerned about large groups of people. As the population increases in the 18th century, and constant threats to the monarchy in terms of they're always concerned in the 18th century about Jacobites and the Jacobite rebellions in 1714 and 45. So the Riot Act is passed as a piece of legislation in response to the Jacobite rebellions. And the reason why I've put this as a starting point is it continues to be the main piece of legislation and piece of public order policing throughout the 18th and into the 19th centuries. So the Riot Act is a piece of legislation that is read out when local authorities, usually magistrates, suspect disturbance of the peace. So they read out proclamation, which you can see on your screen. Which orders the crowd to disperse within an hour. If they don't disperse within an hour, it becomes a felony and people can get arrested, if not shot, by military. This is a containment measure because there is no police in the 18th century, and local authorities are generally magistrates, one or two local gentry who do it out of the good of their kind of civic duty. And the only real forces of order that they can call on are special constables, or if there's local military nearby. So they need the hour to get the military over to the marketplace or wherever the riot is taking place. So generally throughout the 18th century, the Riot Act is the main way in which protest is policed. You see that used particularly severely in the Gordon riots of 1780 in London, when eventually the Riot Act is read and hundreds of people are injured or killed by soldiers who are trying to disperse tens of thousands of people on the streets. So all this starts to change with the age of revolution in the late 18th century. Growing ideas around democracy, growing ideas around working class organisation. And I pinpoint this particularly to the French Revolutionary period in the 1790s. And we see the rise of modern demonstrations from the 1790s, particularly in London, but also in the big new industrial cities like Birmingham and Manchester and Glasgow. Large, huge crowds standing in front of a hustings, listening to speeches, deliberately gathered to show the power of the crowd, the power of the people. Previous large gatherings had been treated as a kind of public order issue. From the 1790s, they're treated as a seditious or treasonable action by the authorities. So the rise of what's called the mass platform is seen as a threat, seen as a revolutionary threat by the Tory government and local authorities, who generally tend to be propertied elites. And so they immediately start to clamp down on these large meetings that are organised by new working class societies who are campaigning for essentially democratic rights. So the cartoon is of Copenhagen Fields meeting in 1795, organised by the London Corresponding Society, who were the largest and best organised working class democratic society. So the reaction from the government is to pass legislation, as well as to call for the arrest of local leaders and put the most well-known leaders on trial. So the response to those large meetings in 1794, 1795 is to pass a Seditious Meetings Act and a Treason Act. I'm particularly interested in the Seditious Meetings Act because it essentially, again, restricts but not prohibits all political meetings. Political meetings now have to have permission from 2 magistrates to take place if they're over 100 people. And this legislation is specifically aimed at those democratic meetings. Middle class gentry meetings are exempt from this legislation. And there are more pieces of legislation like this passed during the post-war period. So after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, there's another rise of democratic agitation. And again, the government responds with more arrests of the leaders and more legislation. And the 1817 Seditious Meetings Act, probably the one that is most used and is still cited later, which again has various stipulations on meetings. It bans meetings from within a mile radius of Westminster when Parliament is in session. And that prohibition's used quite a lot throughout the 19th century. The response from local authorities is to try and either ban these large meetings or arrest the leaders. And it all culminates with the Peterloo Massacre in 1819. When local magistrates in Manchester sent ill-trained yeoman cavalry to disperse tens of thousands of people in the centre of Manchester, and there were a large number of deaths and casualties. The Tory government's response to Peterloo was not to try and make sure that the military were better controlled, but to pass more restrictive legislation. So the so-called 6 Acts, which prohibited large meetings, any sort of military-style action by working class people, like drilling, and also, again, restrict what publications could be published. And this really clamped down on that early wave of democratic agitation. It was a very severe response. It wasn't a totalitarian response or autocratic response, but it did hinder the development of the democratic movement for a couple of decades. Alongside this, trade union legislation is also passed, again, motivated by that fear of revolution, fear of working class organisation. So, most well-known 1799-1800 Combination Acts prohibited trade unions' collective bargaining. This is the era of the early industrial revolution. First, organised trade unions are starting to emerge at this point. That legislation's in place for a quarter of a century. And it's replaced in 1823 by a Master and Servant Act, which undergoes various variations throughout the 19th century, which although the Combination Acts are repealed, that doesn't mean that all trade union activity is legal anymore. The Master and Servants Acts are very harshly implemented. They criminalise individual breaches of contract by employees, and they're tightened up in 1867. And there is a huge number of prosecutions in the courts by employers of individual employees or groups of employees for breach of contract, sometimes during industrial action, but just for any misdemeanor. Estimates about 10,000 prosecutions in the 1850s, 1860s. Although trade union activity starts to emerge and develop in the mid-19th century, sorry, it's still very tightly regulated and quite often repressed, both through legislation and individual employer action. We're just coming up to the Tolpuddle Festival again this weekend. The most famous case, which is celebrated in that canon of trade union history, Dorchester labourers case, subsequently known as the Tolpuddle Martyrs in 1834, is most obviously one of those situations where other types of legislation are used against trade union activity. So although the Combination Acts have been repealed a decade before, the agricultural labourers who formed their own kind of union and tried to achieve a rise in wages were actually convicted under the 1797 Unlawful Oaths Act for swearing an unlawful oath or a secret oath. And there was a huge campaign to pardon them. They were sent to Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania. So the Grand National Consolidated Trade Union organised large demonstrations to campaign for their return. And this marked again that kind of canon in trade union history. But again, there is a kind of long calendar of other cases and other legislation. Again, I won't go into all the details of all the trade union legislation, but what we see is not a linear process of progress. As I say all the time, history goes backwards as well as forwards in terms of rights and the reaction of government to different movements and pressures and public opinion. So it's not until 1871 that the Trade Union Act legalises trade unions as a formal body. And in 1875, further legislation decriminalises all trade union activity, but it's not that soon. Sorry, it's not that long afterwards that Taffrail, again, another key canon point in trade union history, again challenges the place of trade unions, tries to punish them financially. Again, that the toing and froing of legislation around whether unions should be liable for costs incurred by their employees comes and goes. Trade Disputes Act in 1927 prohibits various forms of trade union activity such as sympathy strikes and picketing. That's not repealed until the Labour government comes in after the Second World War, which frees up trade union activity, but then again, most of that freedom was repealed again and reshaped under the Employment Act in the 1980s, which were designed specifically to restrict most trade union activity, and most of the legacies of those acts of the 1980s still exist in our own current trade union legislation today, as you well know. So I'm just going to take a shift away from formal legislation to emphasise that we also, certainly in England and Wales, have a parallel system of common law. And it's actually common law which is used more commonly on the ground policing protest. And particularly common law of nuisance and obstruction. And most of the rest of what I'm going to say is around actually how protest is dealt with as a nuisance, which is a very 19th century term, and an obstruction to the right of passage. So there is no right of assembly in English and Welsh law. There is in European law, human rights law, but not until 1998. So the right of passage along the King's Highway is a common law right, but the liberty of assembly or the right of assembly is not a common law right. So throughout history, your freedom to walk along the streets is often prioritised along over your freedom to stand in one place in the street. And this is where my interest in the law around public space comes from, in that freedom of movement is prioritised over static assembly. And that's often used a lot more in policing on the ground than all this other legislation that I've just outlined. So police tend to use the tactic of moving on in the 19th century. So the Metropolitan Police are instigated in 1829, and a national kind of county system from 1839 onwards. There had been various police forces before then, but this is the kind of official system. And what we see from the development of the police is a shift away from that earlier concern with seditious meetings and treason to just, again, a return to concern about the protest and public order, causing breaches of the peace, causing obstruction. The police are much hated when they're implemented across the country, and it's often the violence that you see at protests is usually around the presence of police. Certainly in the early days, and you could argue all the way up to now. So police officers generally use obstruction as the charge against protesters. That they're obstructing them in their duty or just obstructing the right of passage along the street, and try to move them on. They might also use the 1824 Vagrancy Act, which has provisions against loitering, also begging for money if processions or marches are trying to collect money and donations. And they prefer to use the public sort of common law of nuisance because it's seen as indiscriminatory, it's seen as neutral. Whereas the Seditious Meetings Act and the other legislation were specifically designed against particular political groups. Obstruction, you can just be, the police officer can say, well, I've got no political bias here, I'm just arresting someone for obstructing the street. Obviously, there is bias in policing, that's the whole point. But on paper, it looks more neutral. And there's a shift to more defensive policing, trying to stop protests before they're happening, and also how to regulate and manage protests that have been agreed to be taking place. It's not a linear process. We don't move from reactionary to defensive policing straight away, and there's always a mixture of both. But particularly in the later 19th century, police commissioners tend to wield a lot of power. And I'd just like to pick out a couple. Here's Sir Charles Warren, was Metropolitan Police Commissioner from 1886. He was a Major General in the Royal Engineers. He led the Warren expedition against Transvaal and Boer forces in 1884. And when he'd finished that, his next posting was in the Met. So he implemented quite a colonial attitude and militaristic style to policing, and immediately was opposed by a large proportion of the general public in London for doing that. And it led to quite brutal confrontations with the new movement of unemployed workers who had started to organise in periods of depression. So it culminated in 1887 when, in response to various groups, including the Socialists and the Radical Federation and the unemployed, Warren banned all meetings in Trafalgar Square, issued a blanket ban, which hadn't been done before. And in response to this, the Metropolitan Radical Federation and various of the groups held a large meeting, which ended up being known as Bloody Sunday on the 13th of November, 1887. And a large number of police basically just attacked the crowd. So even after that event, Warren continued his prohibition of meetings in Trafalgar Square. 9 men were found guilty of unlawful assembly, but not guilty of assaulting the police. And in response, investigative journalist W.T. Steed and socialist Annie Besant, excuse me, founded the Law and Liberty Defence League to pay their fines. Warren stepped down in 1888, following criticism of his dealing with the Jack the Ripper case. But the new Met Commissioner was Sir Edward Bradford, who had also come from colonial service in India. And he eventually agreed a compromise that public meetings would be allowed at weekends during the day. But this kind of pattern of quite militaristic, powerful Met Police Commissioners continued. So I'm going to just jump forward to the 30s, and we have Lord Trenchard takes the helm, and his notorious Trenchard ban, as it's known, which is aimed against the national unemployed workers movement, who'd become very organised and strong by the late 1920s during the Depression, who'd organised large protests outside all the labour exchanges against the new means test, which had been seen as very punitive. And he issued a kind of blanket ban against these meetings outside the labour exchanges, but he hadn't consulted with anyone in advance, not even the government. And it just emerged that you would be arrested if you loitered outside labour exchanges. This was in November 1931. The newly formed National Council for Civil Liberties challenged this ban with a test case regarding a group who'd been arrested outside Stratford Labour Exchange in 1934. So again, it becomes kind of point of conflict around the use of public space and the right to protest. So there are also precedent-making law cases. So it's not just about legislation that's passed in Parliament. It's also about particular cases that are brought to court and produce precedents. So again, I'll zoom back in time a bit to the 1880s, and not always seen as a political, political group. Apologies for my coughing and spluttering. Right. Salvation Army hold large parades in the 1880s, which create a problem of public order. Particularly, they're opposed by the group called the Skeleton Army, who are loose kind of federation of publicans who oppose their temperance message and argue that these parades are doing them bad business. And the Salvation Army, quite provocatively, hold these marches, particularly in seaside resorts, which by the late 19th century become very popular as a leisure activity amongst Victorian working classes. And a legal case around a particular march in Weston-super-Mare in Somerset gets to court, almost like a test case. So some Salvation Army members were arrested for unlawful activity in a public thoroughfare after a ban by the local mayor on this parading activity, because he argued that it was deliberately causing fights with the publicans and their opponents. The Salvation Army went to appeal at the Queen's Bench, who rejected the claim that the Salvation Army were acting unlawfully because they were knowingly inducing a breach of the peace by their opponents. And this might not be seen necessarily as a protest. It's particular groups having marches, but it becomes a kind of precedent-making case around the right to march and the right to parade through the streets, which later becomes of incredible significance in the 1930s. So there is a sort of ongoing debate between police and the Home Office and local authorities over what processions, what marches are allowed to occur, and whether, if there is trouble expected, they should be banned or not. The Beattie versus Gilbanks case doesn't fully resolve that, and it's not resolved until the 1930s. The next kind of precedent-making case that is quite often cited in public order debates is Duncan versus Jones, 1936, which goes back to that Trenchard ban that I talked about a minute ago. When the National Unemployed Workers Movement were holding large parades and demonstrations against the Trenchard ban in the labour exchanges, a test case again came to court. So Miss Catherine Sinclair Duncan addressed a meeting outside the Ninehead Street Training Centre in Deptford in 1934. She was charged with obstruction, and the judge established in that case that there was no right of public meeting. English law does not recognise any special right of public meeting for political or other purposes. So this is a case specifically about the right to hold demonstrations around, against the Trenchard ban, but it becomes a precedent around establishing specifically there's no right of public meeting. It also confirmed a shift to this kind of much more heavy policing of protest and processions and marches, and greater powers for police suppression of protest. So the 1930s become a kind of key decade for shaping the rest of the century in terms of debates over what rights to protest we actually have. And the first major piece of legislation is 1936, the Public Order Act, which is a short-term response to Cable Street and the clashes between fascist and anti-fascist marches in the East End of London between 1933 and 1936. There'd already been measures to try and regulate processions and marches as they'd become a problem for policing, not just communists and fascists, but also the National Unemployed Workers Movement and other unemployed hunger marches as well. And it was a controversial piece of legislation. Partly it was quite an immediate response that wasn't long in the making. It allowed police more powers in terms of regulating marches, but there were big debates over the right to march. And Labour members, including George Buchanan, MP for Glasgow Gorbals, and Ellen Wilkinson, the MP for Jarrow, who'd obviously had their big hunger march, warned that this legislation had the potential for future Home Secretaries to ban political processions later at will, rather than just regulate them. So there were concerns over the legislation, and it didn't stop fascist processions through the East End afterwards. There's sort of almost a rise of counter demonstrations and continued disturbances in the East End and in many other cities where the local police commissioners were also debating this issue. So after the Second World War, the rise of new social movements created further issues of debate between Home Office and the police and local authorities. And there are new rights movements that are emphasising the right to protest, and in reaction to the Duncan versus Jones precedent around there is no right of assembly, groups like the National Council for Civil Liberties and other groups are campaigning for legislative right of public assembly, and also against policing of protest in such brutal fashion. There is still the problem of the far right and fascism in this period, and it's still, excuse me, takes up a lot of the correspondence of the Home Office at this time. But the government's attention does shift less away from the far right to the Cold War context of communist and Maoist sympathizers that they see in the global anti-Vietnam War and anti-nuclear movements. And those circulate around the new tactic of sit-ins, which tend to be associated with these new movements, like the Committee of 100. There is a renewal of bans of meetings in Trafalgar Square in response to these new movements by the Met Police Commissioner, and much more violent policing of demonstrations, particularly at Grosvenor Square around the American Embassy and the large demonstrations in 1968. So the other shift that we see in the 20th century is much more of a focus around race and the issue of race in public order. It'd been an issue in terms of the Jewish communities in the East End and around anti-Semitism and racial harassment in the 1930s, but obviously with Commonwealth immigration from the 1950s onwards, it becomes centred around those communities, and tensions in inner cities become the big issue for government and for policing. And again, 1968, Rivers of Blood becomes a kind of pinpoint peak of debate around how that should be legislated. So we also see debates around amending the 1936 Public Order Act to take account of this new circumstance that the far right are now targeting Commonwealth communities in Britain. So there are successful moves to integrate elements of the 1968 Race Relations Act into an amended version of the Public Order Act in 1936 to take account of new provisions against racial harassment. on the streets in public. And race continues to be an issue, obviously, in the 1960s, 1970s, into the 1980s. And we see, just again, key issues around policing on the ground, that whatever legislation is passed, it's actually what police do on the street, and the community relations that really matters. And that we see that particularly in the disturbances and civil disturbances from 1978, 79 to the major riots in 1981 in the inner cities, which have multitude of causes, but studies of the policing of those disturbances have really sort of pinpointed how it's the conflict, long-standing conflict between the local police forces and migrant and immigrant communities that shaped how badly those civil disturbances happened. And so the government again thinks about revising the Public Order Act in response to riots in South London, in Brixton, and also in places like Birmingham, Handsworth riots, and Toxteth in Liverpool. But they're already thinking about this before the 1981 riots. As soon as Thatcher's administration comes in, one of their key things is to set up a green paper and then a white paper on public order and revising the public order legislation. It was part of the manifesto. And again, the emphasis is still on race and the threat of the far right as well, in those initial kind of planning around how to produce a new Public Order Act. By the time 1983, 84, obviously industrial action, miners' strike takes up most of the police's attention. I haven't got time to talk about that. But if you've got any questions later, we can go into that. But what I'd like to point out in the formation of the act that eventually emerges in 1986 is the shift in target. And this is where, for the last part of this paper, I'll sort of show some continuities between the Public Order Act up to the present day, is that despite a lot of the attention from the Green Paper and the White Papers around, and the Scarman inquiry and the various other public inquiries into the civil disturbances being on race relations, National Front, and despite the massive industrial unrest and brutal policing of the industrial unrest in 84, 85, actually the Public Order Act that emerges is quite a shift in target against a particular group of people who weren't a target before the late 70s, which are mobile groups of convoys of new travellers and other groups in society that propertied elites see as not part of British society. So yeah, the new traveller sort of peace convoy movement that had emerged from the 1970s, which was seen as othered, and because it was mobile around the countryside, wasn't seen as part of the settled, propertied conservatism that Thatcher's government in the 1980s was trying to encourage. It also included hunt saboteurs, early environmental protesters, other mobile groups of people who were moving around the countryside and threatening, or seen as threatening, propertied interests. And so the focus becomes on criminalising trespass, which is a civil offence. And this culminates at the policing of the Stonehenge gatherings in 1985, which end up quite brutally, again, police putting down a convoy that had been stopped from meeting at Stonehenge, the so-called Battle of the Beanfield. And a growing convergence of all various, I could go into detail, but various moral panics that the Conservatives and the media and various commentators were bringing together all got targeted in this legislation. The 1986 Public Order Act, which is quite wide-ranging, but you can clearly see from the correspondence is aimed at these new moral panic targets. And it's a similar case in 94, the next iteration of the legislation. Again, similar sorts of targets, new travellers, Gypsy Roma travellers groups are joined by environmental protesters, anti-road protesters, ravers, all sorts of groups who are seen as out-with propertied society are included in this. And so the 94 Criminal Justice Act effectively just tightens up 86's legislation around trespass through assemblies, gives the police more powers to turn back convoys and so forth. So it is a sort of reaction against contemporary and quite short-term social movements that aren't specifically political, but are seen as outwit the conservative vision of society. So I'd like to end just with where we are today, really. Some of the restrictions and the kind of debate over the right to protest should have been really solved by the Human Rights Act 98 and UN and European legislation around the right of assembly, which to some extent I think is being rolled back by contemporary legislation that's been passed in the last couple of years, such as the Police Crime Sentencing in Court Act, which I think, and again, this is debatable, and it'd be good to sort of hear your views on this, has a similar sort of flavour to the earlier Public Order and Criminal Justice Acts, in that it is a sort of knee-jerk or moral panic reaction against particular protest groups who are seen as slightly outside established society. And it also targets particular unacceptable protests that are determined by what is the flavour of the month in terms of what people regard as unacceptable. So it could be disturbance of the peace in terms of noise levels. It could be protests conducted by one person. The provisions against slow marching, which I think is a callback to those earlier debates around what is loitering, what is obstruction by protests. And it echoes earlier reliance of police on moving on obstructions in preserving the right of passage along the King's Highway. So I think there are, although much of this legislation is short-term reactions to particular movements that are seen as problematic in society today, and quite often are seen as threatening propertied or capital forms of property. Actually, there's quite a long continuities over attitudes to what is protest, is there a right of assembly, and what groups deserve to protest and which ones don't, and even what types of protest are acceptable and those that aren't acceptable. So before my voice gives up completely, I'll end that there.